Ladies and gentlemen, when I started looking at the art history of Asia and particularly Southeast Asia, 50 years ago, one of the first books that I noticed was a book by a European writer. I think his name was Frankie, the title of which was The Art of Indian Asia. And I wondered why he called it Indian Asia, as it covered so many other countries of the continent of Asia. Then later, uh, 22 years ago, when I was making arrangements for shootings which I carried out across the world in the major museums across the world, which have collections which include Indian art, I noticed that the great museum in Berlin, the State Museum in Berlin, which had collections of art which ranged from Central Asia to China to Japan and all the way south to Sri Lanka. The name of that museum was Museum of Indian Art. Can't pronounce it properly, but Indisch Kunst, something like that. And I wondered why that was so. And of course, by the time I went for my second time of shooting at the State Museum in Berlin, by then the name had been changed to Museum of Asian Art. But for the longest period of time, it was called Museum of Indian Art. And when I asked why this was so, I was told that the art may be from so many countries, but whether it is in theme, whether it is in content, whether it is in style, whether it is in inspiration, it is after all Indian art. That used to be the worldwide view of much of the art of the whole of Asia. Now, how many are aware that Indian deities, Hindu deities, that we have all the Hindu deities that we worship in India are currently worshipped by the people of Japan in the Buddhist temples. In fact, a deity like Saraswati is the most revered deity of Japan after the Buddha. As a matter of fact, there are hundreds of temples to Saraswati across Japan, scores of them in Tokyo itself. In fact, while Saraswati is worshipped in Japan, and half the temples to Saraswati in that country depict her in the manner that we follow in India today, playing the veena, representing our inspiration, representing our wisdom, representing our knowledge, representing the finer qualities of human life. The other half of the temples to Saraswati in Japan remind us that in fact Saraswati was originally the personification of the great river Saraswati. Therefore, half the temples, hundreds of temples in Japan, are dedicated to Saraswati as a pond of water, as a shrine in the middle of a pond of water. So it's marvelous to see that ancient knowledge, which may be getting comparatively forgotten even in our own country, is preserved so well in Japan. Of course, in Japan, they still worship Lakshmi, they still worship Indra, they still worship Brahma, they worship Shiva, they worship Vishnu, they worship Ganesh, they worship Garuda. The entire pantheon of deities is worshipped. In fact, deities that we have comparatively forgotten in India, for instance, Vayu or Varuna, continue to be actively worshipped in Japan. In fact, Japan is the only place where I've seen a major temple with thousands of visitors dedicated to Indra. Now, how many are aware that the Havan or Homa continues in Japan where it is called Goma? In fact, at least 1,200 temples of Japan have the Homa every day and very often more than once in a day. And best of all, it is accompanied by chanting in Sanskrit. In fact, the wonderful thing is when you observe that the chanting is in Sanskrit and the chanting is being carried out in Sanskrit even by priests who cannot read Sanskrit, you then come into the most beautiful subject of all and you realize that in fact Kana, the Japanese alphabet, was created, modeled upon the phonetics of Sanskrit to make this possible. The Japanese were so concerned about the efficacy of the sounds of Sanskrit that they created an alphabet which continues till today, Kana, the alphabet of Japan. They modeled it upon the phonetics of Sanskrit. And regarding Sanskrit, how many are aware that the 5th, 6th century script of Sanskrit, which does not survive in India, for instance, is still continued in Japan? So if you wish to study Sanskrit in the ancient revered script, you would have to go to Koyasan in Japan, where Sanskrit is still taught in the ancient script. And how many are aware that practically every home of Japan today has in its shrine room, the Sanskrit alphabet? For that alphabet is considered holy, that alphabet is considered divine, and the Japanese worship it till today. So such is the kind of sharing of culture across the whole of Asia which took place in ancient times, of which we have become largely unaware, whether it is the Museum of Art in Berlin, which has changed its name, or so much else. Now, the film which you're going to see today is, I'm told, a unique film. For the temples of Japan and the head priests of the major temples of Japan do not normally allow shooting deep inside, deep within their temple premises. They do not allow the shooting of the inner deities, and they do not give interviews for video cameras. In fact, the Director General of the Japan Foundation pointed out to the India International Center audience when this film was being screened and my photographic exhibition on the subject was being shown by the Japan Foundation. The Director General said, "You are going to see so much that the Japanese people cannot see, for they're not allowed into all those areas inside the temples." As a matter of fact, when I was planning this shooting, I was told by so many scholars who have studied Japan, friends who were being kind to me, that I should not expect to be able to make this film, to be able to shoot this film, because the temples in Japan were not going to cooperate. I still wrote to 50 of the major Buddhist temples of Japan, hoping that at least 4 or 5 may agree, and that would be perhaps quite sufficient to make this film and to carry the point which we are talking about. However, much to my surprise, all 50 of them said yes. And of course, I was helped by the fact that almost 100 of these temples in Japan have very kindly held my photographic exhibition on the Buddhist heritage of India. But ladies and gentlemen, much more than that, it was the kindness of these chief priests in understanding and appreciating my intentions. It was their kindness to appreciate the little bit of knowledge which I have. Because the Japanese are very deeply concerned about the correctness of knowledge. They do not like to see knowledge misrepresented. And that is the true reason why they do not give publicity very easily to that which is important. So it is most wonderful of these so many chief priests that they came forward in their understanding that this was a worthy project, and they have helped to create a film which you're going to see now, which is a fairly a unique film. My many thanks to the people who made this film possible. The Japan Foundation gave me a fellowship which helped me with the last stages of my research on the subject. The Ministry of External Affairs, Government of India, very kindly sponsored the making of this film. The Indian Embassy in Japan were very helpful. And Dr. Mihoko Hiraoka in Japan was a wonderful coordinator for this film. And beyond that, other Japanese people, for instance, Keiko Ito, marvelous, very senior interpreter, translator in Japan, when she came to know from Swami Sitaramanandaji of the Shivananda ashram that I was going to come to Japan to shoot this film and I was going to need help. This very senior and very busy interpreter took time off of a couple of weeks and put herself entirely at our disposal. From morning till night, she would be there taking us to the various temples in Tokyo. In fact, she studied these temples in great detail. She would even spend the night studying further to make sure that at each temple, she would know the particular form of address that the chief priest would expect. Absolutely marvelous. I mean, this is karma yoga of the finest sort. And when Chisato Nakamura heard that another yoga practitioner, when she heard that we were coming, she wrote to me to say that she lived in the north of Japan, but she would be happy to come to wherever that we were shooting and would, entirely of her own, she would come and she would put herself at our disposal to help us. So she came. She came to Kyoto and to Nara. And though she was not as experienced and knowledgeable a person as Ms. Keiko Ito, but what she may have lacked in years, she made up in complete enthusiasm. It was wonderful to see the way that she put herself entirely at the disposal of the making of this film. In fact, it is if karma yoga survives well, I'm sure that Japan is a very great example of a country where it survives. And it survives beautifully, it flourishes. If so much of this culture has spread from India, it is something to be seen and something for us to learn to see it continuing in its finest forms in a country like Japan. Sujata Chatterjee, my co-researcher and associate, my partner, was of course the cornerstone in the making of this film. I must thank her. And then I must also thank the people of Japan whom we met every day during the course of our shooting. So many times during the course of a day, a smile would be put on our face by the extreme kindness and courtesy of a taxi driver, of people on the street, of everybody that we met. It made us so happy. It made the whole journey of making this film into such a beautiful and special one. And I must not forget Dr. Shobha Rani Dash in Kyoto at the Otani University, who helped us so much in Kyoto. And so many people really who made this film possible. So, ladies and gentlemen, I take great pleasure in bringing before you this film, and we'll be happy to speak more about it after the film has been screened. And I would request Mr. Arun Bhargav to please now share his screen and to show us the film. Thank you so much.
Along with the ideas of Buddhism and Hinduism, the culture of Indian deities traveled across the whole of Asia.
Very interestingly, more than 80% of Japanese gods are originally Indian gods.
This close relationship between the people of India and Japan has not been known to most people. Well-researched books on the subject are also not available.
Most of Japanese don't know. For example, I live in Kichijoji, in the outskirts of Tokyo. This Kichijoji literally means Temple of Kisho Goddess. And the Kisho is originally Lakshmi. So thus, I came from Lakshmi town. This should be recognized by Japanese people, the bottom of Japanese culture. Indian culture is very strongly imprinted and developed in the Japanese way.
The Todaiji temple at Nara is one of the oldest and most revered temples of Japan. The 48 feet high Vairochana here is the largest bronze statue in the world.
Already in the 8th century, Indian Buddhist monk named Bodhisena has arrived to Japan, and he inaugurated the eye-opening ceremony of great Buddha of Todaiji temple in 752.
Bodhisena and Buddhasthira, they then went to a temple nearby, Dayanji, where they started the teaching of Sanskrit in Japan for the first time.
When the Japanese studied Sanskrit in the 8th and 9th centuries, Sanskrit was synonymous with the Siddham script. This was used for writing Sanskrit since the 5th century in India.
Thus, Japan and India was very closely connected. If you go to Japanese tomb, you may find sit-down letters. No Japanese can read these letters written on the tomb timber. And again in Japan, there is a Koya-san temples. In these Koya-san temples, they have still sit-down Sanskrit the school. Many monks are learning this Sanskrit, but the Sanskrit is sit-down letters. So perhaps Japan is a time capsule of Indian culture. Already in India disappeared.
There is a deep relationship between Kana, the Japanese alphabet, and Sanskrit. The Japanese wrote Sanskrit through simplified Chinese characters, which developed into the Japanese alphabet, Kana.
And this Japanese, the alphabet pronounced A, I, U, E, O, like Sanskrit, exactly as the Sanskrit.
In Japan, they also use the Indian letters for writing of sacred syllables or bijaksharas, which have the power of mantras. Every Buddhist monastery in Japan has a seal in which there is a bijakshara, a sacred syllable, as a short name of the monastery. There are some words in Japanese which are derived from Sanskrit, like O Seva, from Seva, service. And there are about 100 Sanskrit words which are used in Japanese.
Most of the Japanese, they are using that, but without knowing that that is the originally from Sanskrit. Suppose like they call the Buddhist temples at Thera. Thera means it is from the Pali term Thera, means a Buddhist monk, a bhikshu having 10 years experience.
In the words of His Excellency Mr. Yasukuni Enoki, as I come from the Japanese Lakshmi town, it is no great surprise to me to find that Japanese life is full of so many Hindu deities. Japanese people are unaware of their origins. One of the most revered deities of Japan is Saraswati. There are scores of shrines built to her. In many ways, the original concept of Saraswati and her association with the natural order and good fortune are very well preserved in Japan. She is often visualized as a sacred body of water. In Japan, we find the continuance of so many early ideas of Indian philosophy. The annals of the Todaiji temple mention that the celebration of the worship of Lakshmi and Saraswati was held for the first time in this temple in 722 AD. Ever since, it has been an annual celebration. In 1836, Saito Sachio wrote a guidebook to the Edo area or modern Tokyo. Saraswati was mentioned as the most popular deity here at that time. In 1934, Lady Chiben Sonyo felt that she had become an incarnation of Saraswati. She started writing in Sanskrit, though she had never studied the language. She founded the Benten Shu Saraswati sect. This sect holds water as divine, as it is the abode of Saraswati. We are reminded that Saraswati is the personification of the great river which once flowed in India. Benten Shu also worships her to bestow eloquence and learning. Worship of Lakshmi was done to ensure the peace of the land, wind and rain in good season, good harvests, joy of the people, and the good of all sentient beings. The great intellectual genius of Japan was Kukai or Kobo Daishi of the 9th century. He learnt the Sanskrit script from the Kashmiri Acharya Prajna. Kobo Daishi placed emphasis on a knowledge of Sanskrit. He said that the Japanese have had to rely upon translations to study Buddhism. However, the true words in the original language are exceedingly important. Every word has a profound meaning.
The Japanese people use Sanskrit when they pray. Suppose in Sanskrit they say, Om Saraswati Swaha. In Japanese it becomes Om Saraswati Ke Swaka. In Japan, they are preserving the old Indian tradition because they are following the ancient scriptures. They are also doing the puja and the mudras as well as the sadhana. There is nothing called Japanese or Japanese elements in these. It is the Indian Buddhist Tantric tradition.
The Vajrayana Buddhist traditions of Japan trace their knowledge back to India, to Nagarjuna and other great acharyas of the Nalanda University.
Nagarjuna is known as Gujio in Japan. Without his teaching, the Buddhism of the great vehicle would not have existed.
The Lotus Sutra is a major spiritual creation with a profound impact on life in Japan. It was translated from the Sanskrit by Kumara Jiva 1600 years ago.
This is a temple that follows the Lotus Sutra. The sutra is originally from India and goes back to the teachings of the Buddha himself. It started from India and came to Japan.
A temple is dedicated to the deity Indra in the Shibamata area of Tokyo. It is a most important Indra shrine today.
This temple has 200,000 visitors on the New Year alone. There would be about 2 million visitors every year.
Varuna has been worshipped in many temples in Japan to prevent droughts, typhoons and floods which occur often in Japan. A shrine was dedicated to Varuna in the Fudodo Sanctuary in Tokyo in 1836. The temple also has a representation of Kamadeva. He is worshipped by many young couples. There are many temples dedicated to Yama in Japan.
The sound of the word Yama became Ema as the name traveled and came to Japan.
It is the most ancient temple to Lord Ganesha, which has been in use for the last 1,000 years. And young boys and girls go there to be successful in their courtship. The merchants go there to gain success in their business. The oldest, which has been continuously in worship for the last 1,000 years. And I don't think anywhere in the world we have a temple to Lord Ganesha who has been there in constant worship for the last millennium.
In the 7th century, Prince Shotoku created the nation-state of Japan after vanquishing his rivals. He took the term Tenno for emperor from Sanskrit texts.
And at the same time, he also wrote down a constitution for his country in 17 articles. Article 3 of the constitution clearly points out that the constitution is being based on the three Ratna, the Buddha, the Dharma and the Sangha. This is the first Asian constitution ever written. Important point is that its consecration was done with a Sanskrit text which is called the Ushnisha Vijaya Dharani.
The Sanskrit manuscript used for the consecration of the constitution would have been obtained from the Hindu kingdom of Champa in Vietnam. Havan or Homa continues in Japan, where it is called Goma. Goma in the Shingon and Tendai Buddhist sects of Japan has striking parallels with early Hindu rites of Agni worship. There are also deep similarities with the later Tantric tradition. The Havan is perhaps conducted in Japan at least as often as in India. The Tantric Shingon school of Japan sings Sanskrit hymns. To this day, followers of the sect perform their worship in 1,200 temples throughout Japan.
Esoteric Buddhism is from India, and the big philosophy of the universe is, of course, from India.
Vajrayana Buddhist worship in Japan is similar to to Tibetan Buddhist worship. However, the Japanese tradition has preserved some early Vajrayana rites. A study of Japanese Buddhism helps to fill some gaps in our understanding of the development of Buddhism.
There are 4 types of Shingon mantras or Fudo-myu in Japan. These are the mantras used in Japan which are not in the Japanese language. They are taken from the Sanskrit language of India. In Sanskrit, Fudo is called Achalanatha. He seems to have his origin in the Hindu deity Shiva. The Myu is called Vidya Raja in Sanskrit. Here, it can be safely stated that Fudo Myu has his origin in the Hindu deities of India.
A sutra compares the cosmic force of the mantra with the mighty roar of a rising flood. The mantras were transcribed into ideograms, and to conserve their full power, they were also written in Siddham. Indian letters to a Japanese are sacred and stand for divine beings. To this day, the Japanese write mantras in Siddham.
This booklet contains prayers in Sanskrit that are commonly used in Shingonshu or esoteric Buddhism. It is written in Japanese, but the mantras are in Sanskrit. It is used in many ceremonies in Buddhism. Priests learn the intonation and how to pronounce it by using this booklet, which has Sanskrit and also has Japanese letters to convey the sounds of the Sanskrit words. Every god has his own Bija Akshara. People also worship that Bija Akshara. Every temple gives much importance to those Bija Aksharas because they are equal to God. Visitors bring an album. We call it Shinchin. The visitors go to various temples and collect these Siddham stamps in the albums. These albums are like holy books for the people. We belong to a Zen Buddhist monastery, and we strive hard to sever the bond of birth, senility, disease, and death. The bond which is the cause of all suffering. As the Buddha said, desire is the root cause of pain in the world and should be overcome. This forms the basis of our ascetic practices, which come down to us from the Shakyamuni himself.
Bodhidharma, he transmitted Zen. Zen later has been transmitted to Japan also, and it is one of the most important sects in Japan.
Myths surround the legend of Bodhidharma. Tradition points out that he was a prince of Kanchipuram in South India. The Japanese form of his name is Bodhai Daruma. It is very close to the Tamil form, which is Bodhi Daruma. Zen was introduced in the 6th century. It was a wordless tradition, directly pointing to the human mind and the perception of one's true nature. Zen was taken to Japan in the 12th century by Isai. Its influence on Japanese art, attitudes, and language has been profound.
Zen Buddhism became very popular because it says that life is a fleeting phenomenon. And the samurai, when they went to war, they were never sure that they will come back. In this feeling, they go to war and there is no fear of death. So fearlessness in war was a very important contribution of the Zen tradition. And if you sit down, and when we sit down in a Zen monastery, you have to really do a very hard penance. And hard work in Japan is perfection. So it is the Zen tradition gave them a perfection in work. Force became a very important part of the modern development, perfection in everything.
When I visited India for the first time, I made sure to visit places like Nalanda University, Bodh Gaya, and also the garden path trodden by the Shakyamuni himself. I felt happy to see the university where Tripitaka masters used to come and study during the 3rd and 4th centuries AD. Whatever Buddhism we practice now has its roots in India, and without Indians, there would be no Buddhism in Japan. So many deities are common in India and Japan, and people are worshipping them in both the countries. The hearts of the Indian people and the Japanese people have the same base.
Japan is the one country where Buddhism is flourishing in all its facets. Here, technology and transcendence are living together. The deep-rooted spirit of Buddha's teachings energize the Japanese people. Buddhist temples are numerous and vast numbers of people visit them every day. Besides the Buddha, so many ancient Indian deities and practices are preserved in these temples. An Indian feels quite at home in Japan.
Ladies and gentlemen, it was such a pleasure to share this film with you. Japan is a country which beautifully preserves true knowledge and carries it on over a long span of time. However, when I travel across all the countries in Asia, I come across the remnants of this great shared culture, this great culture which always thought of that which was beyond the material, that which was beyond the ephemeral Maya or Mithya of the world, that was preoccupied with ethics, this marvelous ethical culture which spread across Asia in ancient times. Of course, there are so many other countries, whether it is Thailand, where practically, again, uh, most Indian deities are still worshipped, whether it is Vietnam, where I had the privilege of documenting the ancient Buddhist temples about almost 40 years ago, which most of Vietnam used to be for more than a millennium. It used to be a great Hindu kingdom called Champa. And it is from Vietnam that much Hindu influence, much Indian influence spread across the seas to other places in Southeast Asia and Far East Asia. As was stated in the film, manuscripts and so much else which reached Japan also came from Champa, the great Hindu kingdom of Champa, the great maritime kingdom of Champa. I do believe that that is a kingdom whose importance in history needs to be studied much more. It was a very important pivot in the spread of Indian culture in ancient times. And I would be very happy to answer any questions at this point if you have.
Go ahead.
Well, first of all, Benoy, I enjoyed it very much. I can't see you anymore, but you mentioned why so many people went out of the way to help you to create this monumental work that you shared with us this morning. And I might as well tell you what Sri Krishna told to Arjuna in the 18th chapter and the 14th verse. He said, Adhishthanam tatha karta karanam cha pruthak vidam vividhascha pruthak cheshta daivam chaivatra panchama. All this beautiful action that you have taken, Benoy, there are 5 factors for action. One is the place of action, adhishthanam. Second is a performer, karta, that's you. Then various senses that you use to create this called karanam, and the activities you created with the help of your friends, pruthak preshcheshta. All this came about successfully because there was one yet another 5th factor which was playing quite a bit of role that you were questioning why. That's called Daivatra Panchamam. The 5th factor is Daiva. And that is basically divine grace. So without that, nothing comes about. And I know it from personal experience while creating a Hindu temple in Minneapolis, the difficulties that I had getting permission. The people went out of the way to help us. And when I asked over the last 15, 17 years why they have helped us, they were not able to explain to me as yet, or not given me an answer. So it is all Daivatra Panchamam. So congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much. If I may say, a seeming miracle in the story of man is the spread of ideas across large mountains, across vast oceans, and the warm acceptance of the ideas of life by the people of so many faraway places underlines the sameness of the human condition everywhere. And truly, across the oceans, across the long distances from India to Japan, we see a wonderful example of this great sharing of ideas. And as I was saying before, whether it is Mongolia, whether it is Siberia, whether it is Kalmykia in European Russia, whether it is Sri Lanka, whether it is Afghanistan, whether it is Tibet, whether it is the countries of Southeast Asia, it is so marvelous to see this wonderful sharing of ideas. A sharing of ideas because people wanted to share, because people found something worthy, a treasure to share. And truly, a great reminder of the importance of the philosophic vision and what it contributes to daily life for human beings everywhere in the world. Thank you.
That is so true. When Dr. Sane spoke, he reminded me very much of the experience that my wife Yvonne and I had in 1965. We were returning to India. I would be teaching at the university in Tirupati, and Yvonne would be giving birth to our first daughter. We traveled via Japan, and we went to Japan because we had classmates from college who had spent several years in Japan, 2 or 3. We also had colleagues at the graduate level. And from Japan, where we were to spend a week, we would go to Thailand, and from Thailand to India. Our stay in Japan was so profound that we canceled the trip to Thailand altogether. Mm-hmm. And I didn't think of it at the time, but Dr. Sane, when I heard you speaking, I thought, you know, maybe that was another manifestation of whatever it is that has drawn us to India over all these decades. It was emerging in Japan, and we were not about to let it go.
Yeah.
How wonderful, how wonderful. Thank you so much.
And tell you one more thing, Benoy, just a connection to Minneapolis or Minnesota. We talked about Saraswati today, so beautifully depicted by you. And Minnesota is called the land of 10,000 lakes. So Saras is a big water lake. So we consider Minnesota as a land of Saraswati. So.
How wonderful, how absolutely wonderful. Thank you.
My question was, it just popped in my head, was after the Vietnam War, are any of the temples still there?
Yes. A large number of temples are there. In fact, around 1995, when I went to document them, many of them were in very poor condition. They were some of the oldest ones did not have even a road heading through the forest up to the temple. I remember in one case I had to actually go on a rail bridge, and I was very afraid that if a train were to come, I wouldn't know where to hide or where to save myself. So at that time, they were not in good condition. They were not always accessible. Some of them were in the middle of lands which had been devastated by enemy bombing, and but they were still there. They were there, and it is a great heritage of a large number of temples of the Champa kingdom. I was able to study a little of their celebrations, and their celebrations were in many ways reminiscent of Vedic traditions, and the celebration of nature and the celebration of the fruits of the earth, and the sacrifice of so many things in a havan. And so by now the temples have been better looked after. But you must beware of what is passed off for tourists as Champa dances. They are, how should one put it, more like Hindi filmy dances, and have absolutely no relation to the past and no relation to the past culture. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and appreciate you sharing this amazing work that you have done. Thank you, thank you, thank you.
It is my pleasure.